Welcome to Spider Tales. Parents preferred my brother. They didn't come to my wedding, so I didn't tell them about my son. Let's get straight to the point. Growing up in the shadow of my brother Lucio was always a challenge. For as long as I can remember, he was the center of my parents' attention. Lucio was the prodigy, the pride of the family, the golden boy who could do no wrong. Everything he did was exalted, celebrated, and any failure, no matter how small, was quickly forgotten. I, on the other hand, seemed invisible to them. My childhood memories are marked by a constant feeling of being ignored. I remember every time I got a high grade in school, only to be greeted with a nod or an absent-minded comment, while any small achievement of Lucio's, such as winning a football game at school, was celebrated with gifts and praise. The unfairness of it all fueled a flame of resentment within me, a flame that only grew with time. As Lucio grew up, he became everything my parents had ever dreamed of. He graduated with honors, landed an enviable job at a large corporation, and was surrounded by friends and admirers. My parents, of course, were there every step of the way, applauding his achievements and bragging about his success to anyone who would listen. I followed a different, more modest, but still meaningful path. I landed a steady job, made good friends, and eventually met the love of my life, Carla. But as always, nothing I did seemed to matter to my parents. They never asked about my work, never took an interest in my friendships, and rarely bothered to get to know Carla. When I tried to tell them something about my life, I would get only monosyllabic answers, while they quickly turned the conversation back to Lucio. Over the years, I learned to live with this indifference, but the resentment never went away. And then something happened that changed everything. Carla and I found out we were expecting a baby. The news was a shock, but it also brought indescribable happiness. For the first time, I felt that something in my life was entirely mine, something that my parents could not ignore or disregard. But at the same time, a doubt grew within me. Did I really want my parents to know? When Carla and I discussed the possibility of telling my parents, she was understanding, but she also believed that we should give them a chance to get involved. Carla, I know things haven't been easy with your parents, but I think we should tell them. Maybe with a grandchild, things will change. I nodded, knowing that her intentions were good, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that if I told them, somehow they would find a way to make the birth of my son revolve around Lucio. Me? I don't know, Carla. They've never cared about anything I've done. I'm afraid they'll just focus on how it affects Lucio like they always do. She looked at me with concern. Carla, I understand, but what if it's different this time? What if they really care? Doubt consumed me. Was it possible that the arrival of a grandchild could change the family dynamic? Maybe, but I wasn't willing to take the risk. I decided that, at least for now, I wouldn't tell them. I wanted to enjoy the happiness of pregnancy without Lucio's shadow hanging over everything. Months passed and Carla and I prepared for the baby's arrival. The secret I was keeping from my parents felt like a bubble, ready to burst at any moment. Every time I saw them or spoke to them, the tension grew. They didn't realize it, but the distance between us was growing bigger and bigger. But like all things that are kept secret, this one too had its expiration date. The bubble burst in a way I couldn't foresee. We were at a family gathering, something that happened rarely and almost always revolved around Lucio. He, as always, was the center of attention, talking about his latest achievements at work. My parents were sitting next to him, smiling and laughing proud. Carla and I were in a corner, trying to keep up a side conversation, but it was hard not to feel the familiar feeling of invisibility. At some point, Carla had to leave the room to answer a call, and without thinking much, she left her cell phone on the table. I didn't think anything of it until I heard my mother ask Lucio. My mother, so Lucio, any exciting news? Before he could answer, Carla's phone, still on the table, vibrated. The screen lit up with a message notification, and before I could reach for it, my mother picked up the cell phone. My mother, whose cell phone is this? I tried to take it back, but my curious mother had already read the notice. Her expression changed, first to confusion, then to surprise, and finally to something I could only describe as disappointment. My mother, why didn't you tell us you were having a baby? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me, waiting for an explanation. Lucius looked confused but curious, while my father simply shook his head in disapproval. Carla, who had just returned, stood in the doorway pale. Me, because I didn't think you would care. My mother was visibly hurt. My mother, how can you say that? Of course we care. I laughed, but without humor. Me, you've never cared about anything in my life. Why should this be any different? My father finally spoke, his voice low but firm. My father, we are your family, your name. You should have told us. It's our right to know. Me, right? You've never given me anything but indifference. I didn't want you to turn this into another opportunity to highlight Lucio. Lucio, hey, don't involve me in this. It's not my fault. Me, I know, Lucio. It's not your fault. But you don't understand what it's like to live in someone's shadow all the time. I didn't want my son to start life the same way. The silence that followed was heavy. My parents didn't know what to say, and for the first time, I saw an expression of uncertainty on their faces. Perhaps, for the first time, they were realizing the impact that their preference for Lucio had had on me. But at the same time, I knew that it wouldn't be that easy to change things. After that day, the relationship with my parents became even more tense. They tried to get more involved, but it was clear that the resentment I felt was difficult to overcome. They started calling more frequently, trying to find out about the pregnancy, but I kept an emotional distance, responding curtly and evasively. Carla, on the other hand, thought I should give them a chance. Carla, they seem to be trying your name. Maybe you should let bygones be bygones and let them be a part of our son's life. But I couldn't. Every time they tried to reach out, I felt like they were forcing something that didn't feel natural, like they were fulfilling an obligation and not really wanting to be there. The situation reached its boiling point when Lucio got promoted again, and my parents decided to throw a big party to celebrate. It was the same old story, and I knew that the arrival of my son would be just another footnote to the event. During the party, my parents barely mentioned the pregnancy. Instead, they spent most of the time praising Lucio and his accomplishments. When family members asked about the pregnancy, my parents would give vague answers, as if it were just a small distraction from the grandeur of Lucio's success. Carla, who had tried to maintain a positive outlook until then, began to see things from my point of view. That night, as we drove home, she finally broke down. Carla, I can't defend this anymore. They really don't care, do they? I didn't need to answer. The silence in the car was enough to confirm it. A few months later, our son was born. It was the happiest moment of my life, and for a few days, I completely forgot about the problems with my parents. All that mattered was this little being who now depended on me and Carla for everything. In those early days, I didn't let anyone take away the happiness I felt. But eventually, my parents insisted on seeing their grandson. Reluctantly, I agreed to allow a visit, but it was clear to me that things were still far from resolved. When they arrived, they were surprised to see that I hadn't told Lucio about the baby's birth. In fact, Lucio didn't even know that Carla had already given birth. My mother, why didn't you call your brother? He's part of the family, too. I sighed, tired of the conversation. Me, because this is my moment, Mom. He's my son. I don't want everything to revolve around Lucio, like it always has. My father, you're being selfish, your name. You're trying to cut your family off. Me, maybe because I never felt like I belonged. You always preferred Lucio. Always. Now that I have my own family, I'm choosing how I want it to be. The tension in the room was palpable. My parents were clearly uncomfortable with my openness, but I didn't care. I had been holding these feelings in for a long time, and now with my son in my arms, I wasn't about to back down. My mother, we never meant to make you feel this way, honey. Me, maybe not, but you did it. They left shortly after, without insisting any further. I knew I had created a barrier between us, but for the first time, I felt it was a necessary barrier. As time went on, my parents made less of an effort to get closer. They still treated Lucio as their favorite son, but now there was a clear distance between them and me. Even when we saw each other at family events, our interactions were brief and formal. I knew I would never have the relationship with my parents that I had always wanted, but I was at peace with that. I had built my own family with Carla and our son, and I was determined not to repeat the mistakes my parents had made. Lucio, in turn, began to notice the change in the family dynamic. One afternoon, he called me something rare. Lucio, dude, what's going on with you and our parents? I hesitated, but decided to be honest. Me, they've always preferred you, Lucio. It's always been that way. I'm tired of trying to compete for attention, so I'm focusing on my own family now. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Lucio answered. Lucio, I didn't know you felt that way. Me, of course you didn't know. They've always given you everything. Why would you notice? Lucio didn't have an immediate answer. It was clear that this revelation took him by surprise, but for me, it didn't matter so much anymore. What mattered was that, for the first time in my life, I was living for myself, for my family, without worrying about what my parents or my brother thought. The months passed, and although the relationship with my parents remained distant, I began to notice a change in myself. For the first time, I was at peace with who I was, with the decisions I had made. My focus was on my family, my life, and not on the expectations that my parents had never met. One day, while I was walking with Carla and our son in the park, I received a text from my mother. It was a simple message, but it was loaded with meaning. My mother, I'm sorry for how things went. We'd like to try again, if you'll let us. It was a text I never expected to receive, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to maintain the distance I had finally managed to establish. But another part, perhaps the part that was still seeking some form of validation, considered the possibility. I told Carla about the message, and she smiled. Carla, it's your decision, your name. If you think it's worth it, maybe it's time to give it another chance. I didn't know if I was ready to forgive completely, but I also didn't want to live with regrets. Maybe this time things could be different. Maybe with my son in the picture, my parents would finally see the value I had always had, even if belatedly. I responded to my mother's message cautiously, but with a glimmer of hope. Let's take it one step at a time. And so, with a new beginning in sight, I closed the loop on a lifetime of invisibility, ready to build a future where my son would never have to compete for love or attention. The path would be difficult, and the outcome uncertain, but at least this time the choice was mine. Meetings with my parents began tentatively, like two wary parties testing the waters before a dive. There were missteps, hesitations, and a constant feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. But surprisingly, they seemed to be genuinely trying. My mother, who had previously cared only about Lucio, was now more interested in her grandson. She brought gifts, wanted to know every detail of his life, and even began to show me a warmth that I had never received. My father, who had always been reserved, now asked questions about my work, something he had never done before. My mother, he's so much like you when you were a baby. I think I'm finally seeing things differently. I watched their efforts warily, waiting for the moment when everything would go back to the way it had been. But as the months passed, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, people could change. Lucio remained the star of the family, but now there was a new shining light, and it was my son. He brought the family together in a way I could never have predicted. The comparison still existed, but not with the same intensity as before. I had something that Lucio didn't have, the experience of creating a new life, and that brought me a kind of recognition that I never imagined I would have. There is still a lot to be resolved. The resentment and pain don't disappear overnight. But for the first time, I feel like I'm building something real with my parents, something that can last. And so, the story that began with a life of invisibility and pain is turning into a tale of redemption and new opportunities. It's not a perfect ending, but it is the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where I am seen, where I am loved, and where I can love back without fear. And most importantly, a chapter where my son will never have to doubt his parents' love. I will be for him what I never had, and with that, maybe finally, I will find the peace I've always sought. And that was our story for today. I'll be back soon with more updates. If you've made it this far, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next video. Bye.